The desert stretched endlessly under a sun that showed no mercy, its heat radiating off the cracked earth like the breath of some ancient, angry god. Jack Morrison rode his paint horse with the easy rhythm of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than he cared to count, his weathered hands steady on the reins, despite the tremor that sometimes visited them in the quiet hours before dawn. He was tracking strays again, 3 head of cattle that had wandered off during the storm 2 nights past, their hoofprints barely visible in the hardpan that stretched between the mesas like a forgotten prayer. The silence out here was absolute, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft huffing of his horse's breath. Jack preferred it this way, had sought it out after the war ended and the ghosts followed him home. There were no questions in the desert, no expectations, no women looking at him with that mixture of pity and fear that came from knowing what a man had done with his hands when the world caught fire. Just heat, stone, and the endless sky that asked nothing and forgave less. But then he saw the smoke. It rose thin and grey against the blue, too straight to be natural, too distant to be his neighbour's chimney. Jack pulled his horse to a stop and studied the horizon, his pale eyes squinting against the glare. Smoke meant people, and people meant complications he had spent 5 years avoiding. Yet something in the way it twisted skyward, hesitant and uncertain, made him think of a child's first attempt at a campfire. Inexperienced, desperate. He touched his heels to the horse's flanks and rode toward it. The smell reached him first, acrid and wrong. Not wood smoke or sagebrush, but something sharper, more metallic. As he crested a small rise, the scene spread before him like a fever dream painted in dust and blood. 3 wagons burned in a rough circle, their canvas covers blackened and curling. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt, their forms already drawing the attention of buzzards that circled with patient hunger. The attack had been recent, the ashes still warm, the blood not yet fully dried. Jack dismounted slowly, his hand finding the colt at his hip without conscious thought. He had seen enough battlefields to know death's signature, but this was different. This was thorough, methodical, the kind of violence that left nothing to chance and no one to tell the tale. He walked among the dead with the careful step of a man who had learned to respect the stories that corpses told. Settlers, by their clothes and the goods scattered around them. A family, maybe 2, heading west with hopes heavier than their water barrels. The men had died quick, bullets to the head or heart. The women had not been so fortunate. Jack looked away from their torn dresses and bloodied thighs, his jaw clenching until his teeth ached. A sound made him freeze. Soft, almost inaudible, like a wounded animal trying not to draw attention to itself. He turned slowly, following the sound to the largest wagon, its wooden sides pocked with bullet holes. There, wedged between a water barrel and a sack of grain, was a boy. He could not have been more than 8 years old. His dark hair hanging in his face, his clothes torn and stained with dust and blood that might not have been his own. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his features sharp and fine in the way that spoke of Apache heritage. He clutched something against his chest, his small hands white-knuckled with the effort of holding on. Jack approached with the same care he might use with a wild horse, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy's eyes tracked him, wide and dark, and filled with the kind of terror that aged a soul beyond its years. He made no sound, but Jack could see the tremor in his thin shoulders, the way his breath came in short, silent gasps. "Easy, son," Jack said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "I'm not here to hurt you." The boy pressed himself deeper into the corner of the wagon, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. In his arms, Jack could now see what he held so tightly, a small wooden carving of a horse, its surface worn smooth by countless small hands. A toy, or perhaps something more, a talisman, a last connection to a world that had just ended in fire and screaming. Jack crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He had no experience with children, had lost his chance for a family when the war took everything that mattered. But something in the boy's eyes called to a part of him he thought had died at Gettysburg, a part that still remembered what it meant to protect the innocent. "You're safe now," he said, though they both knew it might be a lie. "What's your name?" The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, his voice barely a whisper. "Tom." The name hung in the air between them, simple and American, and wrong for the face it belonged to. Jack understood immediately. The boy had been given a white man's name, raised in a white man's world, caught between two peoples who saw him as other. Now he was truly alone, orphaned by violence and circumstance into a desert that cared nothing for the color of his skin or the shape of his features. "Well, Tom," Jack said, extending his hand palm up, "I'm Jack, and I think you better come with me." The boy stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, placed his small fingers in Jack's palm. His skin was cold, despite the heat, and Jack could feel the tremor that ran through him, like a constant current of fear. As he helped the boy from the wagon, Jack noticed the way he moved, favoring his left leg, a dark stain spreading through the fabric of his pants. "You're hurt," Jack said, his voice tight with concern he had not felt in years. Tom nodded, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. "They shot my mama," he whispered. "She told me to hide. She told me to be quiet." Jack's throat closed around words he could not say. He had seen too much death, caused too much of it himself, to offer empty comfort about why these things happened. Instead, he lifted the boy carefully, surprised by how light he was, how fragile. In his arms, Tom felt like a collection of bird bones held together by will alone. "We'll get you patched up," Jack said, carrying him toward his horse. "And then we'll figure out what comes next." As they rode away from the burning wagons, Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Behind them, the smoke continued to rise, a dark column against the endless blue. Ahead lay his small ranch, his quiet life, his carefully constructed solitude, all of it about to change because of one small boy who had survived when everyone else had died. The sun was setting by the time they reached Jack's homestead, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded him uncomfortably of the flames they had left behind. The ranch was modest, a single-story house of adobe and timber, a small barn, and a corral that held 2 horses and a handful of cattle. It was not much, but it was honest work, clean work, the kind that let a man sleep at night without too many ghosts visiting his dreams. Inside, the house was sparse but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom barely large enough for a single bed, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and loneliness. Jack had built it all himself, every beam and board, a deliberate choice to create a space where the past could not follow. Now, with Tom in his arms, it felt smaller somehow, inadequate for the task ahead. He set the boy down gently on the rough-hewn table and began to examine his wound. The bullet had passed through the meat of his thigh, missing the bone, but leaving a channel that needed cleaning and stitching. Tom endured it all in silence, his small hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. Only when Jack poured the whiskey over the wound did he make a sound, a small gasp that might have been a sob. "I know it hurts," Jack said, his hands steadier than they had been in months. "But you're brave, braver than most men I've known." Tom looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for their years. "Are you going to take me to the reservation?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. He had not thought that far ahead, had been focused only on the immediate needs of bandaging and feeding and finding a safe place to rest. But the boy was right to ask, what did a broken-down ex-soldier do with an Apache child in a territory where the color of your skin determined whether you lived or died? "Do you have family there?" Jack asked, tying off the bandage with careful hands. Tom shook his head. "My mama said they were all dead. She said the soldiers came and took everyone away, but she hid me. She said I was special because I looked like them." He touched his face, as if feeling for the features that had both saved and damned him. "She said I could have 2 lives if I was careful. Jack felt something break inside his chest, a pain sharper than any bullet wound. Here was a child who had been taught to see his own face as a disguise, his heritage as something to be hidden. The weight of that knowledge, of the choices ahead, pressed down on him like a mountain. "You hungry?" he asked, because it was easier than answering the question that hung between them. Tom nodded, and Jack moved to the kitchen, grateful for the simple task of preparing food. He had beans and hardtack, coffee that was stronger than it should be, and a can of peaches he had been saving for a special occasion. As he worked, he was aware of the boy watching him with the intensity of someone learning to read a new language. They ate in companionable silence, Tom's appetite surprising given the day's trauma. Jack found himself studying the boy's profile, the way he held his spoon, the careful politeness with which he waited for permission before reaching for more food. Someone had raised him well, had taught him manners and respect, and the kind of quiet dignity that could not be learned from books. When they finished eating, Jack built up the fire and made a bed of blankets on the floor. Tom accepted it without complaint, curling up with his wooden horse clutched against his chest. In the firelight, he looked even younger, more vulnerable, a child playing at being brave in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. "Jack?" Tom's voice was small in the darkness. "Yeah? Why did you help me?" "Why?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications Jack was not sure he could answer. Why had he stopped at the sound of smoke? Why had he searched the wagons instead of riding away? Why had he taken on the burden of a child who would complicate every aspect of his carefully ordered life? "I don't know," he said finally, because it was the truth. "Maybe because someone should have helped me once and didn't." Tom was quiet for a long moment, then, "I'm glad you did." Jack felt something shift inside him, some wall he had built around his heart, cracking just enough to let in light. "Me too, son. Me too." They slept fitfully, both of them startling at every sound the wind made against the shutters. Jack kept his rifle close, his ears tuned to the night sounds he had learned to read like scripture. Twice he rose to check the windows, peering out into the darkness that could hide 1,000 threats. But nothing moved except the sagebrush and the stars. The next morning brought visitors. Jack woke to the sound of horses approaching, their hoofbeats muffled by the sand, but distinct enough to pull him from sleep. He rose quickly, motioning for Tom to stay quiet, and peered through the shutters. 3 riders approached from the east, their forms dark against the morning sky. Even at a distance, Jack could see the blue of their uniforms, the glint of brass buttons and steel. Cavalry. "Stay hidden," Jack whispered to Tom, who had already pressed himself into the corner behind the water barrel. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded his understanding. Jack opened the door before the soldiers could knock, stepping onto the porch with his coffee cup in hand, as if he had been enjoying a peaceful morning. The lead rider was a captain, his uniform crisp despite the dust, his mustache waxed to military perfection. The other 2 were younger, nervous, their hands resting too easily on their weapons. "Morning, gentlemen," Jack said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're out early." The captain dismounted, with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. "Jack Morrison." His voice carried the clipped authority of someone used to being obeyed. "That's right. Captain Hayes, 3rd Cavalry, out of Fort Apache. We're investigating an attack on a wagon train yesterday. Heard you might have seen something." Jack sipped his coffee, buying time to think. "Depends on what you mean by something." Hayes studied him with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. 3 families murdered and burned about 15 miles east of here. Apache war party by the looks of it. You see any smoke yesterday? "I saw smoke," Jack admitted. "Didn't investigate. Man learns to mind his own business out here." "Smart policy," Hayes said, but his tone suggested he did not entirely believe it. "Thing is, we tracked the war party south, but we lost the trail in the rocks. We're thinking they might have taken prisoners. A boy, maybe 8 years old, was traveling with one of the families. White-raised Apache, according to the manifest." Jack's blood turned to ice in his veins, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's a shame. Hope you find him." Hayes nodded, then gestured to his men. "Mind if we water our horses? It's been a long ride." "Help yourself," Jack said, though every instinct screamed at him to refuse. "Well's around back." As the soldiers moved toward the well, Hayes lingered on the porch. "You know, Morrison, I've heard of you. 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry, wasn't it? Served under McClellan." Jack's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long that a man forgets his duty," Hayes said, his voice carrying a weight that made Jack's skin crawl. "To his country, to his race." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jack felt the old familiar anger rising in his chest. He had heard this speech before, had seen where it led. The reservations, the broken treaties, the children torn from their families in the name of civilization. "My duty," Jack said quietly, "is to my own conscience." Hayes smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Of course. Well, if you see anything, hear anything, you'll let us know, won't you?" "Naturally." The soldiers watered their horses and rode away, leaving Jack standing on his porch with the taste of lies bitter in his mouth. When he went back inside, Tom was exactly where he had left him, pressed into the corner with his wooden horse clutched against his chest. "They're looking for me," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack knelt beside him, his hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "They won't find you, not here. But they know I'm alive. They'll keep looking." "Let them look," Jack said with more confidence than he felt. "This is my land, my home. No one takes anything from here unless I say so." Tom looked up at him with eyes that held too much hope, too much trust. "You mean it?" Jack felt the weight of the promise settling on his shoulders, heavier than any pack he had carried in the war. "I mean it." But even as he spoke the words, Jack knew they were living on borrowed time. The soldiers would be back, and next time they might not be so easily deceived. He needed a plan, something more than just hiding and hoping. As he watched Tom carefully return to his corner, Jack began to consider options he had never thought he would face. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Jack continued his work, tending the cattle and horses, maintaining the facade of a man living alone. But his awareness had sharpened, his senses tuned to every sound and movement around the homestead. Tom proved to be a quick learner, understanding without being told when to hide and when it was safe to emerge. The boy was healing, both physically and emotionally, though Jack could see the shadows that still haunted his eyes. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Jack would tell stories of his life before the war, carefully edited tales of growing up on a farm in Pennsylvania, of summers that lasted forever and winters that brought sledding and snow forts. Tom listened with the intensity of someone starved for normal human connection, occasionally asking questions that revealed how little he understood of the world beyond violence and survival. "Did you have a family?" Tom asked one night, his voice soft in the firelight. Jack stared into the flames, seeing faces that had been gone for years. "I had a wife, Sarah. She died of fever while I was at war." He paused, the words still difficult after all this time. "And I had a son. He would have been about your age now." Tom was quiet for a moment then. "What happened to him?" "Same fever that took his mother. I got the letter at Antietam after the battle. By the time I could get leave to come home, they had been in the ground for 3 months." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. Finally, Tom spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Jack looked at him, this small boy who had already seen more death than most adults, offering comfort for pain that was old and scarred but never fully healed. "Thank you, son. That means more than you know." It was on the 5th night that they came. Jack woke to the sound of his horses moving restlessly in the corral, their soft wickers carrying a note of nervousness that brought him fully alert. He rose carefully, checking that Tom was still sleeping, then moved to the window. The night was clear, the moon nearly full, casting long shadows across the yard. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar shapes of buildings and fence posts. Then the shadows began to move. They came from all directions, flowing across the landscape like water, silent and purposeful. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. Apache warriors, more than he could count, surrounding his homestead with the fluid grace of men born to this land. They made no sound, left no trail, their movements coordinated with the precision of a hunting pack. Jack's hand found his rifle, though he knew it would be useless against so many. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. They had come for Tom, of course. The boy was Apache, blood of their blood, and they would not let him disappear into the white man's world without a fight. A soft scratching at the door made him turn. Tom stood in the doorway, his wooden horse clutched in his hands, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear or recognition. "They're here," he whispered. "Who's here?" Jack asked, though he already knew. "My grandfather's people. They've come for me." Jack felt the bottom drop out of his world. "Your grandfather?" Tom nodded, his small face grave in the moonlight. "Nana, war chief of the Warm Springs Apache. My mother was his daughter. She ran away when the soldiers came, but they never forgot her, or me." The scratching at the door came again, more insistent now. Jack looked at Tom, saw the boy's internal struggle written across his features. Here was a child caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, about to be forced to choose. "What do you want me to do?" Jack asked. Tom looked up at him with eyes that held too much wisdom for their years. "Let them in. Please, they won't hurt you if I ask them not to." Jack hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to barricade the door and prepare for a siege. But Tom was right. The warriors could have killed him already if that had been their intention. Instead, they waited, patient as the desert itself, for permission to enter. Jack opened the door. The man who entered was old, his face creased with lines that spoke of decades spent under the desert sun. He moved with the careful dignity of someone who had earned his authority through blood and wisdom, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the room. Behind him came another warrior, younger, but bearing the same unmistakable bearing of leadership. Tom stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "Grandfather." "Aye." The old man's face transformed, years of pain and loss melting away as he looked at his grandson. He spoke in Apache, his voice soft and musical, and Tom responded in the same language, their conversation flowing like water over stones. Jack understood none of the words, but the emotion was universal. Family, love, the weight of separation, and the joy of reunion. When they finished speaking, the old man turned to Jack, his eyes appraising. Tom spoke again in Apache, gesturing toward Jack with obvious respect. The old man nodded slowly, then addressed Jack in careful English. "You are the one who saved my grandson." "I found him," Jack said simply. "Anyone would have done the same." The old man smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "No, not anyone. Most would have taken him to the soldiers, collected the reward. You chose differently." Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks. There was no choice. "He's just a boy who carries the blood of two peoples," the old man said. "My daughter thought she could give him a safe life in your world. She was wrong." The weight of that statement settled over the room like smoke. Jack looked at Tom, saw the boy's struggle written across his face. Here was a child who had been raised white, who spoke English better than Apache, who understood more about wagon trains and cavalry patrols than hunting and tribal customs. Yet the blood that ran in his veins marked him as other, as dangerous, as something to be contained or eliminated. "What happens now?" Jack asked. The old man studied him for a long moment, then spoke to the younger warrior in Apache. The man nodded and stepped outside, returning moments later with a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. He placed it reverently on the table, then stepped back. "You have shown honor," the old man said to Jack. "You have protected what was precious to us when you had no obligation to do so. This creates a debt that must be acknowledged." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a war lance decorated with feathers and beadwork, its steel point gleaming in the firelight. Beside it lay a necklace of silver and turquoise, and a small pouch filled with gold coins. "These are gifts of respect," the old man continued. "The lance belonged to my father, and his father before him. The necklace was my daughter's, made for her wedding day. The gold was taken from a supply train 3 moons ago. All of it is yours, in payment for what you have done." Jack stared at the treasures, understanding their significance, even as he felt the weight of their implications. "I can't accept this. I didn't help Tom for payment." "I know," the old man said. "That is why you must accept it. To refuse would be to dishonor the gift and the giver." Jack looked at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. With careful hands, Jack lifted the lance, feeling its perfect balance, the smoothness of wood worn by generations of warriors. It was beautiful and deadly, a weapon that had seen battles he could only imagine. "There is one more thing," the old man said, "a choice that must be made." He turned to Tom, speaking in Apache again. The boy listened intently, his face growing grave. When the old man finished, Tom looked up at Jack with eyes that held a question and a plea. "He says I can choose," Tom said quietly. "I can go with them, learn the old ways, become Apache fully, or I can stay here with you and they will protect us both." Jack felt his heart stop. "What do you want to do?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his small hands twisting around his wooden horse. "I want to stay with you, if you'll have me." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, unexpected and overwhelming. He had not dared to hope, had not even allowed himself to consider the possibility. But here was this boy, this child who had already suffered so much, choosing him. Choosing a life that would be difficult and dangerous, but honest. Choosing family. "Of course," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course I'll have you." The old man smiled, an expression that held both sadness and approval. "Then it is decided. But know this, Jack Morrison, you have chosen to raise an Apache boy in a white man's world. There will be those who will not understand, who will see only the color of his skin and the shape of his eyes. You will face hatred and fear, and men who believe that the only good Indian is a dead Indian." Jack felt steel enter his spine, the same resolve that had carried him through 3 years of war. "Let them come." "They will," the old man said. "And when they do, you will not face them alone." He gestured toward the window, and Jack realized for the first time that the warriors had not left. They stood in a perfect circle around the homestead, their forms barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakably present. 100 men, maybe more, armed and ready. "From this day forward," the old man continued, "you are family. Your enemies are our enemies. Your fights are our fights. The boy you have saved is precious to us, and we will not let him be taken again." Jack felt tears prick his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. He had lived alone for so long, had built walls around his heart to keep out the pain of loss and disappointment. Now in one night he had gained not just a son, but an entire people willing to call him brother. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say you will raise him well," the old man replied. "Say you will teach him to be strong and honorable and proud of all the blood that runs in his veins. Say you will love him as your own." Jack looked at Tom, this brave, broken boy who had chosen to trust him with his future. "I promise." The old man nodded, then knelt before Tom, speaking to him in Apache one final time. The boy responded, his voice steady despite the tears that ran down his cheeks. They embraced, grandfather and grandson, the old man's weathered hands gentle on the boy's dark hair. When they separated, the old man stood and walked to the door. "We will be watching," he said to Jack, "not as threats, but as guardians. Raise him well, brother." And then they were gone, melting into the night as silently as they had come. Jack stood in the doorway, watching the shadows return to normal, wondering if he had dreamed the entire encounter. But the lance still stood against the wall, the necklace still gleamed on the table, and Tom still stood beside him, small and real and his. "Are you scared?" Tom asked quietly. Jack considered the question, thinking of the challenges ahead, the hatred they would face, the constant danger that would follow them. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of them, of failing you, of not being the father you deserve." Tom slipped his hand into Jack's, his small fingers warm and trusting. "You won't fail. You saved me when no one else would. You chose me when you didn't have to. That's what fathers do." Jack felt something inside him heal, some wound that had been festering for years finally beginning to close. He squeezed Tom's hand gently, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settle on his shoulders like a blessing. "Well then," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him, "I guess we better get some sleep. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to be a family." Tom smiled, the first real smile Jack had seen from him since that first day in the wagon. "We'd like that." As they prepared for bed, Jack caught sight of himself in the mirror and was surprised by what he saw. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, the perpetual tension in his shoulders had eased. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who had something to live for. Outside, the night was quiet, but Jack knew it was the quiet of protection rather than abandonment. Somewhere in the darkness, warriors kept watch, ready to defend what had become precious to them all. Inside, a boy slept peacefully, his wooden horse clutched in his hands, his dreams finally free of smoke and screaming. And in the space between sleeping and waking, Jack Morrison allowed himself to hope. Hope that love could transcend the boundaries of blood and culture. Hope that a broken man and a lost boy could build something beautiful together. Hope that in a world defined by violence and hatred, there was still room for the simple miracle of family. The months that followed were not easy, but they were good. Jack taught Tom to ride and rope, to read the weather and the land, to handle a rifle and a man's responsibilities. Tom taught Jack to laugh again, to see wonder in small things, to remember what it felt like to be needed. They faced challenges, of course, neighbors who looked askance at the Apache boy riding beside the white rancher, soldiers who asked too many questions, townspeople who whispered behind their hands and crossed the street when they saw them coming. But they faced them together, and somehow that made all the difference. And sometimes on nights when the moon was full and the desert sang its ancient songs, Jack would catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, figures that watched and waited, ready to remind the world that some bonds could not be broken by prejudice or fear. Tom grew taller, stronger, more confident. He learned to move between worlds with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to both and neither. And Jack learned that family was not about blood or tradition or the color of skin. It was about choosing to love someone enough to fight for them, to stand with them, to call them home. Years later, when Tom was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them the story of the night 100 warriors came to welcome a cowboy into their family. He would tell them about the old man who gave up his grandson to love, and the broken soldier who found redemption in the smile of a lost boy. And in the telling, the legend would grow, passed down through generations of children who learned that in a world too often defined by its divisions, love remained the most powerful force of all. Love that transcended race and culture and the small fears that kept people apart. Love that chose courage over comfort, hope over hatred, family over everything else. The desert remembered it all, holding their story in its vast silence, a testament to the truth that some bonds are stronger than the forces that seek to break them. And somewhere in the endless expanse of sand and stone, the spirits of warriors and cowboys, grandfathers and sons, continued to watch over those brave enough to choose love in a world that too often chose fear. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the color of their skin, or the language they spoke, or the gods they worshipped, just the simple revolutionary act of two souls choosing to call each other family, and the 100 warriors who came to welcome them home.